I think to the question of whether the former director is a conspiracy theorist is not really something I have thought about.
Do you still believe it came from nature, Dr. Garry, Dr. Anderson?
Yes.
I do. I'm not aware of whether papers has been censored specifically focused on the lab leak.
American tax dollars went to this lab in China. Is that right, Dr. Garry?
I don't know I don't have any information myself about
The scientific evidence for this pointing to a single market in the middle of Wuhan is overwhelming. I must first address several allegations made about our work. The select subcommittee majority has alleged that our paper was orchestrated by Dr. Anthony Fauci to cover up a lab origin of SARS-CoV-2 as directed during a February 1, 2020 conference call. It has also been suggested that a grant awarded to myself and colleagues from 5 different countries was a quid pro quo for changing our conclusions. These allegations are false. First, the claim that Dr. Fauci prompted the drafting of proximal origin to disprove the lab leak is not true. In an email to the journal Nature, I stated, prompted by Jeremy Farrar, Tony Fauci, and Francis Collins, we have been working through much of the primarily genetic data to provide agnostic and scientifically informed hypotheses around the origin of the virus. There was no prompting to disprove or dismiss a potential lab leak. In fact, when I outlined my initial hypothesis about a potentially engineered virus, Dr. Fauci told me, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you think this virus came from a lab, you should write a scientific paper about it. Not only is this not a prompt to disprove the lab leak theory, it was specifically predicated on our initial hypothesis of a lab-associated virus. The allegations that Dr. Fauci prompted the drafting of proximal origin to disprove the lab leak is quote mined from an email I wrote to participants of the February 1 conference call. The scientific method is based on 2 basic concepts of 1, formulating hypotheses, and 2, testing those hypotheses, often by trying to disprove them. My initial hypothesis was a lab theory. When I stated that we were trying to disprove any type of lab theory, I was specifically referring to us testing our early hypothesis. This is textbook science in action.
When was your first conversation with Dr. Fauci about the origins of COVID-19?
I believe that was on the 31st of January 2020.
And yes or no, he suggested you write a paper during that conversation, correct?
Dr. Fauci suggested that I consider writing a paper specifically predicated on my initial hypothesis, which was that of a lab-associated virus, correct?
Then you had the February 1st conference call that had Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, and Dr. Farrar on it, correct?
There were several scientists, including those, yes.
Was Dr. Tabak also on that call?
I believe he was on the call. I'm unsure about that.
Did Dr. Fauci reiterate a suggestion to draft a paper on that call?
I don't believe that he directly suggested it, but there was support for us looking further into the origin of the pandemic, yes.
I wanted to ask Dr. Fauci, could you address these suggestions or concerns that this virus was somehow man-made, possibly came out of a laboratory in China? You studied this virus. What are the prospects of that?
Yeah. There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve. And the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human. So, I mean, the paper will be available. I don't have the authors right now, but we can make that available too.
Do you still believe it came from nature, Dr. Garry, Dr. Anderson?
Yes, I do believe that the natural origin via the wildlife trade is the most likely origin based on all the science, all the data that we've analyzed.
Dr. Anderson?
I do. And I think it's important you mentioned the six researchers here. In the recent report, again, the IC continues to assess that this information neither support nor refutes either hypothesis of the pandemic's origin, because the researchers' symptoms could have been caused by a number of diseases.
Actually,
This is in the middle of the
Dr.
flu
Anderson, I'll reclaim my time. The IC believes that the origin of COVID-19 is from the lab. Most of the intelligence community believes that, and they've stated so. So is the Energy Department.
What contributions did Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins make, or did they mostly just listen?
Well, they did mostly just listen. They had very little to offer on the science. I think they were there to gather information.
Okay, now, Dr. Anderson, you said you began yourself with the initial hypothesis that there had been or may have been a lab leak, but you ended up not believing in that theory. Why? How did you change your mind?
I think it's important to understand that we're talking about early hypotheses here on which our thinking over time evolved. And that then led to the conclusions published in a peer-reviewed paper. I would like to point out that this timeline of 3 days, I don't know where that's coming from. The paper was published on the 17th of March, 2020. That's 45 days after this conference call. What's important to understand is that the thinking evolved from initially thinking that this could have been engineered to relatively rapidly discount that idea as being inconsistent with the available evidence. However, the lab leak theory itself, or the idea of a lab leak, can be many different things, and our continued evolution of that then followed that I was quite convinced that maybe it was cultured. And then from there, eventually realized that actually that is also unsupported. And that's what led to the conclusions in proximal origin.
Well, let's move on to an email that you sent to your co-authors. You wrote, and this has been, I think, much misunderstood. Our main work over the last couple of weeks has been focused on trying to disprove any type of lab theory. Now, you explained in your opening statement that you meant pursuing the scientific process by which you have an hypothesis which stands unless it's disproven. Is that right? Is that what you meant by that?
That is correct. I'm referring to the concept of what's called falsification, as Chairman Wenstrup mentioned too. Yes.
The falsification of a theory. Yes. All right. So has there been any attempt, to your knowledge, to censor any papers that would contradict the conclusions that you arrived at here? Or put it differently, you mentioned in your opening testimony that Dr. Fauci had encouraged you to write a paper about the lab theory if that's where the evidence took you. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm not aware of whether papers has been censored specifically focused on the lab leak. I will say again, if you look at the scientific evidence, it all points in one direction, which is the single market in the middle of Wuhan in China as the starting point of this pandemic. There are many papers out there that have described potential lab leaks, which are typically using sort of gods of the gaps type of analogies, where you're trying to say that the data is not perfect, so everything remains still possible.
Dr. Anderson, do you believe that the former CDC director, Dr. Redfield, is a conspiracy theorist? Yes or no? Yes or no?
I think to the question of whether the former director is a conspiracy theorist is not really something I have thought about. So
well,
I don't
know,
like
because
to
you
label
just accused
people as
everyone who believes that there was a lab leak to be a conspiracy theorist. And back in March, the former director of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, came before this committee, and he said that it was not scientifically plausible that the virus went from a bat to humans and subsequently became one of the most infectious viruses in history. When asked why he was excluded from the February conference call that both of you, as well as 10 other scientists, had with Dr. Fauci, Dr. Redfield told us that Dr. Fauci wanted a single narrative surrounding the origins of COVID. But both you and Anderson Garry also expressed concerns about the genetic makeup of the virus just days before the initial draft of this paper came out. So were you both conspiracy theorists at that time? On January 29, 2020, Dr. Fauci emailed you after you had expressed concerns to him on a phone call that you believed COVID would have been engineered. He told you that if this was true, you had to contact the FBI. You did not do that, correct?
I believe the email says that he will contact the FBI.
Okay. Do you know, either of you had contact with the FBI? Yes or no, to your knowledge?
At the time, no.
Okay. But then you reaffirmed those engineering concerns in an email to Dr. Fauci, which you say the unusual features of the virus make up a really small part of the genome, and that after discussions earlier today, Eddie, Bob, Mike, and myself all find the genome is consistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. Again, were you a conspiracy theorist at that time? And did you share these same concerns on the February 1st conference call? Because Dr. Garry went so far as to say, quote, I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario when you get from the bat virus or one very similar to it, COVID-19, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotides, and all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature, unquote. So then, within a matter of days, something changed. And that's what this committee is trying to get to the bottom of. What happened within that 3-day period between the conference call and the paper that all of a sudden you did a 180?
So my understanding is American tax dollars went to this lab in China. Is that right, Dr. Garry?
I don't know I don't have any information myself about
It's been commonly reported that EcoHealth sent the money there. American tax dollars were used in the Wuhan lab, this lab we've been talking about.
Again, I haven't reviewed the financial transactions between the NIH and EcoHealth Alliance.
Okay. Dr. Anderson, just real quick, and I know you've touched on this earlier. So on January 31st, the now email that, somewhat famous email that you sent, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. I think that was part of that email and comments Dr. Garry made, where it was what prompted the conference call. And then 4 days later, you come back and basically say, if you believe it came from a lab, then it's some crackpot theory. And what happened in that? I mean, that's a pretty dramatic change in 4 days. And I know you've talked about it before, but that's what I think I find so concerning is you went from virus looks engineered, not consistent with evolutionary theory, to you're crazy if you think it came from a lab, and that all happened in 4 days.
So that is a misrepresentation of what the email actually says. Let me just read that sentence, because I say the main crackpot theories going around at the moment related to this firing being somehow engineered with intent, and that is demonstrably not the case. I'm very specifically referring to the fact that this is engineered with intent, i.e. a bioweapon.
Okay,
at that time, I still
fair enough.
believe-
So you're saying there wasn't an intention to have it this done in a lab, but so you're not saying it couldn't have come from a lab?
That is correct. At that time of writing this email, in fact, I thought the plausibility of this being a lab-cultured virus was still high. I kept that belief until mid to late February.
Do you think you've been strong on the zoonotic theory? Do you think it could have come from a lab, even today as you sit here?
Not as I said here today, no. I think the plausibility of this having come from the lab, given the evidence, I don't find that plausible at all.
FBI is wrong. People who disagree, people who think it came from a lab is wrong. The fact that American tax dollars went to a lab in China, a lab that wasn't up to code, should have been level 3, even based on what you guys say, wasn't up to code, doing, I think, potentially gain-of-function research, and it breaks out in that town in China. But somehow, no, it can't even be possible that it came from a lab. It has to be the zoonotic approach.
It is possible, as I'm saying. I don't find it plausible, or maybe I should say probable, given the evidence that we have available to us. Again, anything is possible, and as we are saying in the proximal origin paper and also in later papers, is that it is currently impossible to prove or disprove any version of the origin, whether lab or not.
I'm addressing what we heard Radcliffe tell us as a committee that wasn't the case, that overwhelmingly the information at hand provided by the intelligence communities showed that this was not a naturally occurring process. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you said the recently declassified report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence does, as you said, conclude that there is no evidence to suggest this virus came from the lab. However, the ODNI also states in their reports the Department of Energy and the Federal Bureau of Investigation assessed that a laboratory-associated incident was the most likely cause of the first human infection of SARS-CoV-2. Dr. Anderson, you also said in your testimony, we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible. And yet the conclusions by the Department of Energy and the FBI directly contradict your position. How do you bring that together?
I think you could say that our conclusions completely contradict their conclusions too. I think it's important to understand that we are looking at different things here. You're talking about the intelligence community. If you look at the scientific literature, the scientific evidence for this pointing to a single market in the middle of Wuhan is overwhelming. There is no evidence.
But the Intelligence Committee had access to both scientific and the investigative reports. They had that overview. And their conclusions strongly contradict what your single conclusion projects.